To the beginning of Unit 3 in Second Language Acquisition. And in this lecture, I'm going to tackle quite a bit of the theory, the most recent theory, around how it's believed that we learn languages, how humans are able to do this. And we'll just start to talk about the process that looks like. And in the lecture that follows this one, we'll tackle that part as well. Now, one of the ways that you can watch yourself develop as a professional is to see how your language changes. And so I've got a list here of the terms that I'm going to include in my talking with you today. And these are also terms, many of which that show up in the readings that you'll do or the videos you'll listen to after this particular lecture. So take a look with me at the terms. Universal grammar, which is also known as UG in our profession, marked and unmarked, interlanguage, a key term, developmental errors, overgeneralization, undergeneralization, the U-shaped curve, another key idea, transfer, or it's sometimes called positive transfer, interference, contrastive analysis, and cognates and false cognates. So this is where we're headed. But I want to start out by giving you a bit of a puzzle. Okay? So the first part of the puzzle, take a look with me at this quote. This is a quote from my son Isaac when he was 2.5 years old. So let me tell you first about the situation in which he said this. So I was cooking in the kitchen, and Isaac came in to the kitchen. He was kind of on all fours, but he wasn't down on his elbows. He was using his hands and using his feet, so kind of on all fours, and he was moving his head back and forth like he had something in his mouth, and he was making growling sounds. Now, I know enough about child psychology to know he was pretending, and so I said, "Hey, Isaac, what are you?" And he said, "I'm a dead, diseased dog with a lizard in my mouth." Now, I had never said this sentence to him. His father had never said this sentence to him. No one around him, none of his family, his extended family, his preschool teacher, no one had said this to him. So the first puzzle I give to you is, how could it be that a child at 2.5 could say this, could come up with this idea and these words, this particular utterance, and no one's ever said it to him before? Okay, so that's the first one. The second riddle is this one. So in the United States, when a child is born deaf, so when a child is born and cannot hear, most of the time, statistically, that child is born to hearing parents. So that means that two parents who probably speak English as their first language, they at some point, hopefully early in their child's life, find out that the child cannot hear spoken language. And so the parents, as they should, immediately reach out to any way that they can begin learning American Sign Language, which is the natural language of people who are deaf in the United States. So, for example, in our community at times, there's actually been a group learning ASL at a church on the South Hill. And the community college at times has taught American Sign Language. There are videos, there are books, so they reach out and they begin learning American Sign Language as fast as they can, and they begin using signs with the child as quickly as they can. So they learn a sign, they use it with the child. Now, that's not the riddle. That's good parenting. What's the riddle? The riddle is this, that as the parents are learning American Sign Language as their second or third or fourth language, they are making lots of errors. And they are using those errors as they're signing with their child. But when the child begins to sign, the child doesn't make those errors. How can this be? So you've got two riddles there. And if your idea of how we learn language is grounded in the idea that it's merely repetition, that it's merely memorization of what we hear around us, that it's merely giving back what we've already taken in as input, then your explanation of language learning can explain those two riddles. What we're going to do in this lecture is to take a look at someone who can explain what's going on there. And his name is Noam Chomsky. And he came up with this idea called universal grammar, or UG. Now, just this summer, a series of articles came out. I'm sure you didn't see them because this wasn't a part of what you were paying attention to yet in the world. But a group of articles came out this summer saying, Chomsky's wrong. We found holes. We're able to prove that there are holes in his theory of universal grammar. And so I read some of those articles this summer, and I've actually included one in the reading that you'll do right after you finish this lecture. Do I think they've disproved universal grammar? No. But what I do think they've done is they've shown there's some other things going on in addition to universal grammar. So what's all this about universal grammar, and how does it explain what Isaac was able to say, and how does it explain that children who are born deaf learning American Sign Language from people making lots of errors don't make those errors? How can it explain that? Well, I am very visual, and I think in pictures, I think in metaphors. And when I think universal grammar, I think of a filing cabinet. So I'm going to explain the theory of universal grammar using my own language with the idea of the metaphor of a file cabinet. And then we'll see where that gets us. And hopefully where it gets you is an understanding of what it is. So let's just imagine that when a human child is born, that in their brain is something like a file cabinet just for information about how language works. Now, in the 30 years or so since Chomsky, no, I guess it's more than that, probably 40 years since Chomsky came up with his idea of universal grammar, we now know that the Broca's area on the left side of the head, just slightly above the ear, that is where understanding and use of language is stored in the human brain. So this idea of a file cabinet just ready to take in information about language is probably the same as Broca's area. So how does this work? Well, just imagine that the file cabinet is empty when the child is born, but there are file drawers and there are empty files. What are the files for? Well, there's a file for how to show plural. There's a file for how to show past. There's a file for how to show personal ownership of something. Do you see where this is going? So a child's brain is born ready to take in information about these particular aspects of language, how to show past, how to show plurals, how to show possession. But the files are empty. There's nothing in them. So when a child is born in a country that perhaps has an African clicking language, some of the sounds, the consonant sounds are actually clicks, that child is ready to take in information about how that language works. If the child is born in an English-speaking family in the U.S., that child's brain is ready, that file drawer is ready to take in information about how language works. Now, the thing is that once that file, each of those files gets enough evidence for how language works, then the child begins paying attention to other aspects of language, right? So So once a child has enough experience with English, if a child is born into an English-speaking family, and hears the plural S again and again and again, and actually hears that it's pronounced in different ways, sometimes like a Z, sometimes like an S, sometimes like the sound is. So they hear this over and over again, and they get enough evidence in that file, and they move on to other things and pay attention to other things. And so this explains how a child can take in information about how a language works and then create at a very quick age. And also, once they take in enough information, then they notice how the rules work and they apply those rules. Does that make sense? So if you take the idea of universal grammar and we go back to Isaac's quote, "I'm a dead, diseased dog with a lizard in my mouth," then what we know is that Isaac had taken in a lot of information about, for example, how we create a clause like a dead, diseased dog. Dog is a noun, and dead and diseased are adjectives. And he's picked up enough information to know that syntax in English, we place the adjectives before the noun. And then he's got a determiner here. And so he's known to create this. He had enough information in those files to create this. But what he had to say is his own creation. He's not mimicking anything anyone else said. And when you take this idea of universal grammar and you apply it to a child born into a hearing family, and the child is deaf, mom and dad are using American Sign Language as fast as they can, but they're making lots of errors, that child is taking in the language, filling up files. Once that child gets enough evidence about how a rule works, they apply the rule, and voila. We don't have the errors that they've been exposed to showing up. Instead, we have the rule applied. And that's how universal grammar has really impacted the way that we've moved from an idea of language learning as simply repetition, memorization, mimicking, to a very creative and intelligent process that Chomsky argued is just part of our biology. Now, when other people talk about the file cabinet, and I am the only one that you will hear talk about it in that way, they talk about a language acquisition device, or an LAD. So that is a term that'll show up in Unit 4 again as well. So it's this idea that there's this natural piece of our biology built into our brains that is ready to take in information about how the language or the languages that we're exposed to will form. And a quick note here about a child who's growing up in more than one language. What happens then? What if a child's parents, one is a native speaker of English and one is a native speaker of French? And what if both of those parents are very eager to connect with their child in their native language? And so one parent is speaking mostly English and one parent is speaking mostly French. Isn't that a problem? Wouldn't that confuse the files in the file cabinet? No, it would not. What would happen is the child would essentially have two different file cabinets going at the same time. And every time mom is speaking to the child in English, file papers are going in. And every time dad speaks to the child in French, files are being filled with evidence about what those rules are. Now, in the past, people have argued that when children grow up in multilingual homes or bilingual homes, they point out that the children usually don't speak at the same time that other monolingual children do. So for example, with my children, they all spoke their first words around 11 months or 12 months, and they were all forming sentences by a year and a half. For a child growing up in that home, I was making up the anecdote with mom, who's an English speaker, and dad, who's a French speaker. For that child, probably the first words would be a little delayed, and probably the first sentences would be a little bit delayed. Now, does that point to a problem? No. It points to an amazing intellectual endeavor that that child is engaged in, and that is filling 2 different file cabinets at the same time with information about how those 2 separate languages work and keeping them separate. What we now know, and also articles came out this summer supporting this idea again, is if a child does grow up bilingually, that actually their intelligence will be 2 or 3 points higher probably on a measurable scale than a child who grows up in a monolingual family. So any delay you might notice yourself or you hear about from others does not indicate an intellectual kind of struggle. What it indicates is the child's taking in twice as much information. Things there might be less production at an earlier age, but the child will catch up and in fact probably statistically be even more intelligent. Okay, so far we've talked about universal grammar. Let's very quickly, before we move on, talk about marked and unmarked. Now, when I talked about this metaphor of the file cabinet, and I talked about these files, like a file for plural, a file for past tense, a file for showing personal possession, right, like my. There are lots of options, and probably by now you've experienced at least 2 languages. And so you know that a lot of languages, for example, show plural by adding an S at the end. And if not an S, something else. And that is a very consistent and, if you think about it, a very easy way for a language to choose to show plural. That is what's called an unmarked choice. A choice that's kind of the easy route. It's more simple. Every language has aspects of itself that are the easy route. They're very simple. And it creates with language in a more difficult way. So some of those files are filled with very simple, easy rules. And some of those files in every language will have more complicated rules. Those complicated rules are called marked. And so marked is a fancy way of saying the more difficult and unusual pathway that a language can take. And unmarked, the easier, more popular pathway that a language can take. Okay? So all of that is about universal grammar, and that's where we need to kind of ground our thoughts. As I said, people have argued that universal grammar doesn't explain everything. We need additional pieces. And very quickly, what I will say is I think what's really being argued is not that universal grammar is wrong, but rather we need to consider some other amazing abilities that humans have that make sense of language, right? So, for example, if you say to a young child, "Can you close the door?" If you just parse that sentence, if you simply decode it, it really is talking about ability, right? So a child could say, "Yes," but then just sit there. But we know that if you say to a child in English, "Can you close the door?" the child may say nothing, stand up, walk across the room, and indeed close the door. How do they know to do that? Well, the latest articles are saying universal grammar linguistics can't explain it. We also need pragmatics the amazing social understanding and social intelligence that humans have. So the first place that you go after this reading is to take a look at a very readable article from Scientific American that's talking about what is universal grammar, taking us back to the idea, and then talking about the additional things that need to be added as well. The next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about this idea of interlanguage. Now, for much of language teaching history, we have believed that errors are a bad thing and that errors need to be stopped immediately. They need to be punished. Students need to learn the correct way. And that this is the way that students move forward. Interlanguage is a very different approach to how we learn language. Interlanguage is the idea that once a student begins learning a language, once a child begins learning a language, that they have in their mind all these hypotheses about how language works. So for example, I'm learning Spanish right now. I started in the fall of 2012, and I'm still I'm probably a high beginner in my language. And so if you had some nifty or creepy x-ray machine and you could take a look at what my hypotheses are about how Spanish works, some of them are likely to be correct, and some of them are probably incorrect. In fact, I know are incorrect. But the thing is that snapshot, if you could really take that kind of view of my hypotheses of Spanish, that is where I am in my language learning process. And that entire process is called interlanguage. So from the very first day I learned my first word of Spanish until the day that I hope, master Spanish, that is my interlanguage. And this gives you a very different idea about the role of errors. Because in this idea of interlanguage, we now believe that errors are a natural part of the process. These are just what happen because we have these hypotheses, and some are right and some are wrong, and the wrong ones will lead to errors. But we have to keep trying them out. And we need to continue being exposed to the language to figure out how our ideas about the language work and how our ideas about the language need to be rethought a little bit. So every time I read an article in Spanish, every time I chat with someone on Skype in Spanish, every time I make a trip to Nicaragua, I'm paying attention, I'm noticing how my ideas seem to work, how they don't, and I'm developing and taking more steps in my interlanguage. And so interlanguage believes we must have errors. And I've got the term written here, developmental errors. And so this is the belief, they must occur. Now, let's jump down over here to these three sentences, or these three sets of utterances that I've written down. And these are very similar to what I have recorded back to my child Isaac. I have recorded for him that he would say at different points, but they're also very universal. So these are stages that children go through in English. So take a look at this. Stage 1, I cried, I ran, I ate, I walked. Okay, so far so good, right? So what we have is we have a subject, I, in each sentence. We have a verb in each one, and each one is in past tense. Notice that cried and walked are what are called regular past tense. You're just adding an ed. Well, it's a little bit different here, isn't it? We have a spelling issue. But for a child, a young child, a preschooler saying this, they wouldn't even have to worry, of course, about spelling. They would just be uttering it orally. Take a look at what happens in stage 2. And again, My child Isaac said this, but this is very universal. This is very typical. I cried, I run, I eated, I walked. Now we've got some problems, don't we? So I cried and I walked stayed the same using the regular past tense. But I runned and I eated. What's wrong with that? If you guessed that the problem is that the correct form of the past tense of run and the past form of eat is irregular, it doesn't follow the rule, then you were right. What we have here is we have a child applying the rule of how to form past tense across the board and ignoring the exceptions. Take a look at stage 3. And again, everybody gets here. I cried, I ran, I ate, I walked. Now what's going on? Well, what's going on in child psychology? What's going on in child language acquisition across these 3 stages? In the first stage, the child is pretty much just mimicking back what the child is hearing. So they've heard this and they're producing it. Stage 2 happens very quickly after stage 1. And that is, think about that file drawer, starting to fill up with evidence about how past tense works. How does past tense work in English? Most of the time we add an ed to the end, which can have slightly different sounds, d, t, or id. And so here, the child, is just applying the idea across the board. Stage 3. Now, they realize, yes, there is this rule, but there are also exceptions. And so stage 3 and stage 1 end up looking the same. Okay? Now, if you believe that errors are bad, if you come from the idea that any errors that a language learner, whether it's their second language or their first language, any errors that they produce need to be weeded out and they're a problem, then what you don't recognize is that errors are actually a sign of a mind at work. You can see what the hypothesis is here. The hypothesis is, in English, you add ed to form the past tense. That is what the hypothesis is. And what happens here? A different hypothesis. In English, most of the time, you add an ed to a verb to form the past tense, but not always. There are some exceptions. And so what you actually see when you pay attention to a young child's language and you watch that development, you actually see their hypotheses changing. And so that really kind of captures the way you, as a teacher of English language learners, are going to look at your students. The errors that they make, they're not bad. They are, in some ways, beautiful things that give you an insight into how their hypotheses work right now about how English works, or whatever language you're teaching, how that language works. And making more errors is not only always a bad idea, right? It's not always a bad sign. It means that they might be overgeneralizing, here's the word here, overgeneralizing a rule. So in step 2, a child that goes through this stage, spoiler alert, all English-speaking children go through that stage. They are overgeneralizing a rule. They're taking a rule and applying it 100% or more than, simply more than it needs to be applied. So that's called overgeneralization. And that is a type of developmental error. Undergeneralization is when a child is, or a language learner of any sort, is not applying a rule as often as it needs to be applied. And that, for me, if I go back to that idea of the file cabinet, there's simply not enough input yet. There's not enough evidence yet that the child or the student can figure out they can rely on this rule. And so they're under-applying it. Now, under generalization, I have this term, the U-shaped curve. And that is this. It looks like this, right? So at first, the child is producing language that looks native-like. It looks like it's language that's been mastered. And then things look pretty dire. The child is making lots of errors. But then we come back here. And now the child is producing language that sounds more mastery-like, that sounds more native-like. And that is the U-shaped curve. So again, what are some of the insights, and we'll draw upon this in the next unit when we take a look at methods. And then in next quarter, in the methods course, when we really throw ourselves into this, we're really going to be drawing our strength from this idea. Errors are not bad. They give us insight. They help us see where we can provide more evidence to a student about how a language works. Okay? So back to this idea of interlanguage, developmental errors, overgeneralization, undergeneralization, the U-shaped curve. Is that the only reason that students of a second or third or fourth language, does this explain entirely the errors that they make? Are they simply developmental? So in other words, if I'm a native speaker of French and you're a native speaker of Spanish and both of us are learning English, are we going to make exactly the same errors? Because we're going through exactly the same stages and following exactly the same developmental errors. No, there will be a few differences. And when we take what we know from our first language and we apply it to the learning of our second language, sometimes it works and fits, and sometimes it doesn't, right? So for example, in English, when I know to add a plural, I add S. And as a Spanish learner, I apply that to add, I add the S to make a plural, and I'm correct most of the time, right? There are very few exceptions in Spanish. And so that is an example of what we call transfer or positive transfer. I have my bags packed already with English. I have my file drawer full of evidence about how English works. I bring it with me to my learning of Spanish. When it helps me, it's called positive transfer. Does it always help me? No. Sometimes it gets in the way. And you'd think we'd call it negative transfer, but we don't. Just to be fancy and TESOL, we call it interference. And so think about it. I've got my bags packed with what I know about how English works. I take it with me to Nicaragua. I apply it to Spanish. When it helps me, it's called transfer or positive transfer. When what I know about how English works doesn't match up with how Spanish works, then I have interference. Okay? Now, it used to be that we believed that interference was the biggest reason that students made errors as they're learning a second or third or fourth language. And now we know most of the time they're actually just developmental errors. Yes, indeed, there is interference, but it doesn't play the role that the important role that we thought it did. Okay? When we look at two languages, and we want to see if we're looking at these two file drawers or two file containers, and we're comparing English and Spanish, for example. if we want to see how they match up and what the differences are, and the idea would be then to become a better teacher of students from that language, because you'd have already kind of an inkling of where they might struggle. That field of linguistics is called contrastive analysis. And just as we used to believe that most errors came from interference, but now we believe that most of them are really just developmental errors, contrastive analysis used to take on a bigger role in this field than it does now. But it's still important. And their interference is real. And related to interference, I wanted to bring up some terms that I bet you've already heard or even used yourself in another context. Cognates and false cognates. Cognates are words between two languages that are very similar. And so there are some words that I can take with me from English into Spanish. Maybe it's not pronounced the same, maybe the spelling is a little bit different, but packed in my bags of English, all these tens of thousands of words that I know, there are some I can use in Spanish. False cognates are when a word looks the same or looks very similar between your first language and your second language, but they do not mean the same. An example is actualmente in Spanish does not mean exactly the same as actually in English. And embarazada in Espanol, in Spanish, actually means pregnant, not embarrassed. And so those are some examples where words may look the same, they may look like cognates, but they're not. That is just a tiny, tiny way that the bags you have packed from your first language may help or may not help in that second language. So the information you have may apply or may not apply. So let's just take a look, again, very quickly before I let you go. Let's take a look at where we traveled together in this lecture today. We started out with two riddles about children producing language. My son Isaac at 2.5 producing a sentence that I couldn't explain that he could say because I'd never said it, no one around him had ever said it, or anything quite similar. And then I gave you the example of a deaf child born into a hearing family being exposed to lots of developmental errors produced by parents learning American Sign Language as quickly as they can, and yet the child does not make those errors, and they simply follow the rule. And I pointed for you to universal grammar as a theory that you can use to explain why those things occur. That language learning is about taking in evidence about how rules work, and then humans taking over and creating with language very quickly and producing things that they've never been exposed to. Every human is unique, right? We talked about interlanguage. Interlanguage might be the key term that you get from this entire course, and it might be the key concept, because what it should do for you is to kind of dull your fears that errors are something to be afraid of in your language classroom, and also to reinforce this idea of a language learner as a really powerful person who is constantly thinking about language and taking in more evidence, even when you don't see that happening. It kind of, for me, connects with this idea of the growth mindset. People are talking right now in education about the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. For me, it connects with the growth mindset. It means that you as the teacher assume that the student is where they are, it's where they belong, and that they will move forward as long as you participate in helping to produce an environment that they can learn in, that they will learn. We also talked about the concept of transfer. We talked about how what a student brings from their first language, it may actually help quite a bit in the language classroom, just as my understanding of English really helps me with Spanish. That's transfer or positive transfer. And most of the time in this field, when we talk about the ways that that first language actually doesn't apply to the second language, those rules are not the same as the second language rules. That is called interference. Okay, where I want you to go from here, I want you to take a look at the articles and the short video that follow. There you will take a look at ideas around interlanguage. You'll take a look at ideas around universal grammar, error analysis, contrastive analysis, and just do your best to try to take it in and notice in many of the videos and the articles, you will see a lot of these terms coming up. Listen for them, look for them, and simply do your best to start to absorb where we are in our understanding of how languages are learned. Enjoy the rest of the unit.